It's 2:17 a.m., and if you're still awake, maybe you've been thinking about something you heard today. Someone said something loudly confidently, with the air of a seasoned expert, and something in you hesitated, not because they were wrong, but because they sounded so sure. And yet it didn't feel right. You ever wonder why the people who know the least often speak with the most certainty? Why the loudest voices rarely carry the most depth? This isn't about intelligence. It's not about education. It's not even about being wrong. It's about something far more dangerous, not knowing that you don't know. There's a name for it. A mirror of sorts, smudged but honest. The Dunning-Kruger Effect. And once you understand it, you start seeing it everywhere. At work, at dinner tables, on every scroll of your feed. Sometimes, even in the mirror. If this quiet unraveling of self-deception speaks to you, like, share, subscribe. Not for algorithm, but for awareness. This is Silent Sage Stories, where we don't raise our voices, we deepen them. And now, let me tell you about a man who walked into a bank, covered his face with lemon juice, and thought he'd become invisible. He wasn't crazy, at least not in the way you might think. His name was MacArthur Wheeler. In 1995, he walked into two Pittsburgh banks, broad daylight. No mask robbed the tellers at gunpoint, and walked out as if the world owed him an apology. Later that night, the police showed up at his door. They had him on camera, crystal clear. But Wheeler was stunned. "I wore the juice," he said. See, he believed genuinely that rubbing lemon juice on his face would make him invisible to security cameras. Wait, because lemon juice could be used as invisible ink. That was the logic. And he believed it. Not because he was dumb, but because he didn't know that he didn't know. That moment, both absurd and heartbreaking, sparked the curiosity of a psychologist named David Dunning and his student, Justin Kruger. They didn't laugh. They asked, "How can someone be so wrong and still feel so right?" What they uncovered changed the way we understand ourselves. Because Wheeler wasn't an anomaly. He was a mirror. And in that mirror, Dunning and Kruger found all of us staring back with certainty, when maybe we should have been staring with doubt. They designed a study, simple tasks, logic, grammar, humor. Each participant was tested, then asked to estimate how well they did. The results: those who scored lowest thought they did best, and those who scored highest thought they did worse than they actually had. It wasn't just overconfidence. It was a failure of self-awareness, a blind spot in the mind that hides itself from the inside. The very skills you need to be competent are the same skills you need to recognize competence. Without them, you can't just perform poorly. You don't even realize how poorly you're performing. You can't correct a map if you don't know you're lost. And so begins the loop. Incompetence, breeding, false confidence, blocking growth, growth never arriving, because the problem never announces itself. Only now, with a name, Dunning-Kruger, we start to see the contours of the trap. But names alone don't save us. Insight is not immunity, because even knowing this, you and I are not exempt. The real danger, it's not out there. It's that quiet certainty when you're wrong and don't know it yet. And what's worse, the less you know, the more confident you feel, because ignorance is rarely accompanied by doubt. It arrives dressed in certainty, wears conviction like a badge, and raises its voice not because it's right, but because it has no reason to suspect it's wrong. That's the cruel twist. True beginners don't know what they don't know. They stand atop what researchers call Mount Stupid, a sudden surge of confidence after a shallow dip into new knowledge. You learn a little and think it's a lot, because the vastness of the subject hasn't yet unfolded before you. But then if you keep going, something breaks. Confidence collapses. You see how deep the well really goes. This is the valley of despair, the point where many quit, where the illusion shatters and the real work begins. To climb again, not with ego, but with effort. Not for applause, but for understanding. Few stay, but those who do begin the long ascent toward true competence. Not louder, not bolder, just quieter and more precise. And when they finally arrive, not at the peak, but the plateau, something strange happens. They begin to doubt again, but this time the doubt is earned. It isn't self-loathing, it's self-awareness. Experts often underestimate themselves, not because they lack skill, but because they've seen the boundaries of the map. They've touched the edges of complexity and know how much still remains unknown. As Bertrand Russell put it, the whole problem with the world is that fools and fanatics are always so certain of themselves, but wiser people so full of doubts. This isn't modesty, it's metacognition, the ability to think about your thinking, to question not just what you know, but how you know it. And if that sounds abstract, it's not. It's practical, urgent, because in a world flooded with information, where everyone has a voice, and every voice claims authority, our survival as thinkers depends on something deeper than confidence. It depends on calibration, the quiet skill of knowing when to speak and when to wait. But calibration doesn't come naturally, not to the novice who just discovered a fact and mistook it for a framework, not to the internet prophet armed with certainty and a YouTube algorithm that rewards it, not even to you or me. When we enter a new field, mistaking recognition for understanding, fluency for depth, clarity for truth, we forget how easy it is to stack shallow insights into what feels like expertise. Because the internet teaches quickly, but it does not teach well. It gives us speed without structure, access without hierarchy, confidence without comprehension. And so we scroll. We learn just enough to believe we know. We speak just loud enough to drown out the experts. And we mistake engagement for evidence. But wisdom isn't viral. It's quiet, cumulative, hard-won. And if we ever hope to find it, we have to learn to pause before the peak, to ask one more question before we answer, to notice when our certainty feels a little too easy, because sometimes the most dangerous thing is not being wrong, but being wrong confidently. It's trusting the voice in your head because it sounds familiar. It's standing in the valley with a map drawn in crayon and thinking it's a compass, and yet we've all done it. You, me, everyone. The Dunning-Kruger Effect isn't some distant academic curiosity. It's a shadow we carry, especially when we feel certain, especially when we feel smart. So what now? Do we stop speaking, stop learning? No, we just start differently, not with the answer, but with the question, not with the microphone, but with the mirror. Because the antidote to false confidence is not silence. It's sincerity. And the first sincere act is admitting what we don't know. You're listening to Silent Sage Stories, where even unknowing has its own kind of wisdom. Now breathe with me, and let's go deeper. There is something holy about not knowing, not in the mystical sense, but in the quiet humility of stepping back from your own mind and saying, I might be wrong. I need to listen. I'm still learning. That kind of humility doesn't shout. It doesn't trend. It doesn't win debates in comment sections. But it's the soil where real understanding begins. And if more people practiced it, if more of us paused at the edge of our opinions and looked down into the depth of what we didn't know, we might argue less and wonder more. If this reflection stirred something in you, even slightly, pause with it. And if you'd like to help others, pause too. Like, share, subscribe. Not because I said something right, but because we need more spaces where not knowing isn't punished, but honored. You're listening to Silent Sage Stories, and in this next part, we'll step into the real world, where the Dunning-Kruger effect isn't just psychological theory, but a daily performance. At work, in medicine, in politics, in every meeting you've ever sat in with someone who was sure, but not sound. Let's go. You've met them, the coworker who interrupts every meeting with half-formed strategies delivered with full confidence. The family member who watches one documentary and becomes an overnight expert on foreign policy, climate change, or the brain. The internet stranger arguing with PhDs, using memes and caps lock as credentials. These aren't anomalies. They're the consequence of a world that teaches expression, but not reflection. A world that rewards those who speak first, not those who think last. In the workplace, the Dunning-Kruger Effect shows up like a fog. Employees overestimating their competence. Managers convinced of their vision, even when outcomes prove otherwise. People so sure they're excellent, they stop listening. In fact, studies show that 95% of managers rate themselves above average, which is statistically impossible. And yet, here we are, and it gets worse. Because the more confident someone is, the less likely they are to seek feedback, reconsider, or ask for help. Why would they? They already know. But what they don't see is that confidence, untethered from competence, isn't strength. It's blindness. In healthcare, this can turn deadly. Medical students with the weakest skills often rate themselves highest. They make bold decisions, skip second opinions, dismiss patient concerns. Not because they're cruel, but because they genuinely believe they're right. It's not malice. It's miscalibration. And miscalibration, when lives are on the line, is not just dangerous. It's devastating. And yet, this same dynamic plays out in politics, in education, in every sphere where complex issues are flattened into slogans by people who mean well, but know too little to know they're wrong. Social media makes it worse. Here, everyone gets a microphone, but not everyone earns it. The algorithm doesn't ask if you've studied the topic. It just asks if people clicked, and the loudest voice, not the wisest, often wins. It's what some researchers now call an expertise crisis, where perception flattens, where the difference between a novice and a specialist is reduced to font size and follower count. Imagine a world where every voice has equal volume but not equal weight. Now realize you're already living in it, because platforms don't promote doubt. They reward certainty. Bold claims, hot takes, and those most vulnerable to the Dunning-Kruger effect, those who've read the least, learned the least, reflected the least, are often the most visible. Not because they know more, but because they think they do. And in a world that confuses confidence for truth, that's often enough. But the danger isn't just digital. It's cultural. In the West particularly, America, confidence is currency. From classrooms to boardrooms, children are taught to believe in themselves long before they're taught to question themselves. Self-assurance is seen as strength, hesitation as weakness, and so we perform certainty, even when we're unsure, especially when we're unsure, because appearing competent is often more rewarded than being competent. Contrast that with many East Asian cultures where humility is woven into the social fabric, where students routinely rate themselves below average, not because they lack ability, but because they've been taught to doubt themselves first before claiming knowledge. Neither approach is perfect, but one makes room for growth. The other traps us in illusion. As Confucius said, real knowledge is to know the extent of one's ignorance, a truth we forget when we trade wisdom for performance. But no culture, no system, no society is immune, because the Dunning-Kruger Effect isn't just a cultural flaw, it's a cognitive one. It doesn't care where you're from. It cares how your brain works. And all our brains have blind spots, even those who think they're immune. Especially those who think they're immune. Because this isn't just about other people. It's not just that your boss overestimates herself, or that guy in the comments section thinks he's a legal scholar because he read one article. It's about you. It's about me. It's about the subtle ways we overestimate our grasp on things we've only glanced at. The times we correct others on topics we barely understand. The moments we confuse familiarity with mastery. The truth, we are all at some point members of the club that doesn't know it's a club. The first rule of the Dunning-Kruger Effect is that you don't know you're under it. So how do we break the spell? How do we step outside the fog when the fog lives inside us? The answer isn't quick. And it certainly isn't easy. But it begins with one quiet gesture, asking for feedback from someone who knows more than you. Someone willing to be honest, and then actually listening, not defensively, not performatively, but with the kind of stillness that makes space for being wrong. Because feedback is the mirror you can't hold up alone. Without it, you might polish your flaws, thinking they're features. With it, you begin to see clearly, but only if you're willing to trade comfort for correction. And most people aren't, because it hurts to learn you're not as skilled as you thought, to hear what you missed, to be humbled by the gap between how you see yourself and how you show up. But that's the price of escaping the illusion and the beginning of real growth. Of course, feedback alone isn't enough, because if the mirror is cloudy, you still can't see. That's why deliberate practice matters, not just repetition, but repetition with reflection. You don't just do the thing. You do it, get feedback, adjust, and repeat. Without that loop, you might get better at feeling confident, not being competent. And then there's the deeper work, the quiet habit of thinking about your thinking, metacognition. It sounds abstract, but it's simple. It's the voice that says, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I don't see the full picture. Maybe there's more to learn. It's the pause before the post, the hesitation before the hot take, the breath before the argument. It's not weakness, it's strength in disguise. Because the moment you start questioning your certainty, not with paralysis, but with purpose, you begin to reclaim your mind from illusion. And that is the beginning of wisdom. But the hardest part, learning to live without the comfort of knowing. Modern life doesn't reward uncertainty. It doesn't pay you to say, I'm not sure. I need to think. I don't know. It rewards speed, certainty, sound bites. And so to stay afloat, we learn to fake it, to speak with confidence before comprehension, to pretend, because pretending pays. But what if we resisted that? What if we chose, in small moments, to be the person who says, I'll need to read more? Can you explain that again? I was wrong. Not for show, not as a performance of humility, but as a practice of freedom, because that's what it is. To live with uncertainty, to hold space for doubt, is not to be lost. It's to be open. It's to walk through the fog with your hands out, feeling forward, step by uncertain step. That's not weakness. That's the beginning of seeing. Socrates called it the only true wisdom, to know that you know nothing, not in despair, but in awe, to see the boundaries of your knowledge, not as limits, but as invitations, because every I don't know is a doorway, to read, to ask, to grow. And yes, it's slower. It doesn't trend. It won't win arguments on Twitter. It won't make you the star of the meeting. But it might make you better. And that's the quiet revolution to choose depth over display. To speak less, but with more weight. To carry your knowledge not like a weapon, but like a lantern, dim, steady, real. If this conversation has brought a crack to the armor of your certainty, good. That's where the light gets in. You're listening to Silent Sage Stories. Like, share, subscribe. Let's keep walking, because the journey doesn't end with awareness. It begins again. Every time you enter a new field, a new conversation, a new role, you start over. You arrive at the base of another Mount Stupid, and you begin the climb once more. That's the paradox. The more you learn, the more you see how much you don't know. Knowledge doesn't shrink your uncertainty. It expands it. As your circle of understanding grows, so does its edge. The contact point with all that remains unknown. That edge is where humility lives. It's also where wonder lives. Because the moment you stop needing to know everything, you start being curious again. Not to prove, not to perform, but to understand. And maybe that's the deepest truth the Dunning-Kruger Effect reveals. That wisdom isn't found in having answers. It's found in asking better questions and being quiet enough to hear what they're really asking back. So here we are. You've seen the curve from ignorance to insight, from arrogance to awe. You've met the man in the lemon juice. You've seen the manager in the mirror. You've heard the voices shouting online and felt the pull to join them. And maybe, just maybe, you've started to hear something softer underneath, a quieter voice, yours, asking not to be right, but to be real. And that's where we'll leave it, in the stillness that comes not from certainty, but from clarity. Because if the Dunning-Kruger Effect has taught us anything, it's that the greatest illusion is not to ignorance. It's thinking you've outgrown it. So stay curious, stay humble, stay open. And if this story helped loosen something in you, like, share, subscribe, not because you need more answers, but because you're learning to ask better questions. You're listening to Silent Sage Stories, where we don't just tell truths, we learn how to listen for them. And remember, when someone speaks too loudly, too quickly, too certainly, pause, not to judge, but to wonder, what don't they know that they don't know? What am I not seeing? Because this isn't just a story about psychology. It's a map, a way to navigate the crowded terrain of false expertise and the quieter, lonelier path of true understanding. You won't always know when you're wrong, but you can learn to listen for the edges, for the subtle discomfort that whispers slow down. Look again. That whisper is your teacher. Honor it. And when others don't, when they confuse noise for nuance, confidence for clarity, meet them with something rare, not mockery, not due defensiveness, but compassion. Because overconfidence isn't always arrogance. Sometimes it's fear wearing armor. And sometimes what someone needs most is not to be corrected, but to be heard long enough to soften. So be gentle with them, with yourself. We all carry blind spots. We all overestimate, under-reflect, rush to speak when we should be still. But if we can hold each other in that space of not knowing with grace, with patience, with a little bit of wonder, then maybe we begin to build a wiser world. Not louder, not faster, just truer. And if that's a world you'd like to help build, like, share, subscribe, not for the clicks, but for the quiet revolution. Because in the end, what the Dunning-Kruger Effect teaches us isn't just about human error. It's about human hope. The hope that with enough reflection, enough humility, enough honest listening, we can move from illusion to insight. Together, you're listening to Silent Sage Stories, where we walk the long road from confidence to clarity and find ourselves still learning. You don't have to look far. The effect is everywhere. Woven into office dynamics, wrapped around headlines, echoing through social media, like a chant we forgot we were chanting. Let's start close. At work, you've seen it. The colleague who derails meetings with confident but misguided advice. The manager who overpromises and underdelivers. The team lead who dismisses feedback because they already know. It's not always ego. Often it's blindness, the kind that comes from just enough knowledge to feel informed, but not enough to see the full terrain. In one study, 95% of managers believed they were in the top 50% of performers. Do the math. Confidence isn't just common, it's inflationary. And when it rises faster than competence, we get cultures of performance without reflection. Environments where people speak to be heard, not to understand, where feedback is seen as threat, not gift, where the loudest voices drown out the most thoughtful. And in those rooms, the ones where certainty echoes louder than sense, something begins to wither. Curiosity, the humble drive to ask, to wonder, to test one's assumptions against something larger. Because why question what feels so right? This isn't just a workplace issue. It's a human one. And nowhere is it more dangerous than in healthcare. Imagine a young medical student, bright, driven, but inexperienced. Now imagine they rate their clinical skills higher than their peers, more than they should. They begin making decisions with conviction, but not competence. They skip second opinions, dismiss uncertainty, forget that every body is a mystery, not a checklist, and suddenly, overconfidence isn't just frustrating, it's fatal. Because what the Dunning-Kruger Effect teaches us is that danger doesn't always wear ignorance. Sometimes it wears a smile, a white coat, and just enough knowledge to go unchecked. And still it gets louder. In politics, we see this effect amplified, broadcast, elected. People with the thinnest grasp on policy science history, offering the strongest opinions, simple answers to complex problems, certainty without study. Because in a media environment that rewards clarity over complexity, the confident flourish and the thoughtful, they hesitate. They qualify their statements. They say, "It depends." But nuance doesn't go viral. Conviction does. And so we begin to confuse volume with validity, charisma with competence. We choose leaders not for what they know, but for how they make us feel. And often feeling sure is enough. But nowhere is this more visible or more invisible than online. Social media doesn't just magnify the Dunning-Kruger effect, it monetizes it. Platforms reward engagement, not expertise. Clicks, not context. And the result? A flood of voices, all confident, all sure, all speaking at once. The internet flattens authority. A virologist's thread sits beside a conspiracy post. A climate scientist competes with someone who just discovered research on a meme page. And to the untrained eye, they look the same. Same font, same format, same certainty. But one holds complexity. The other just holds volume. This is what some call the death of expertise. Not because experts have disappeared, but because no one knows how to recognize them anymore. And in this flattened world, everyone becomes their own expert. Watch one video. You're informed. Read 3 articles. You're ready to debate. Google something twice. You're basically qualified. But comprehension is not the same as familiarity. Knowing the words doesn't mean you know the wiring. And yet, confidence blooms, not from understanding, but from access. We mistake proximity for mastery. The way holding a scalpel doesn't make you a surgeon. And then we teach each other. We repost. We argue. We anchor our egos to half-formed truths until opinion hardens into identity and correction feels like an attack. Because when your self-image is built on knowing, admitting you don't feels like death. And so we protect ourselves, not with evidence, but with echo chambers. We curate our feeds to reflect what we already believe. We follow voices that sound like ours. We block, mute, unfollow anything that introduces friction. This creates a digital illusion, a false consensus where everyone around you seems to agree. And in that illusion, confidence grows. Certainty sharpens, but not truth. This is what researchers call epistemic closure, the sealing off of your mind from contradiction. And it's comforting, deceptively so, because in that sealed world, you're always right, always affirmed, always confident, but never quite growing, because growth requires tension. Learning requires doubt. And if your reality never includes either, you might not be learning. You might just be looping. So what do we do in a world where access outpaces understanding, where opinion outshines expertise, where certainty is easy and humility is rare? How do we hold on to wisdom? It starts with recognizing what confidence really is. Not loudness, not bravado, not knowing it all, but calibrated belief in proportion to reality. Performance psychology calls it epistemic humility, a mouth that speaks only after the mind has listened, a mind that listens even when it already thinks it knows. Because confidence misaligned is dangerous. But confidence aligned with awareness is powerful. It motivates action, fuels perseverance, helps us face failure, and still return, not to prove, but to improve. Research even suggests that a small overestimation of your abilities can be helpful, just enough to nudge you forward, to keep you in the game, to weather the discomfort of early failure. It's what psychologist Albert Bandura called self-efficacy, the belief that you can figure it out even when you haven't yet. But here's the line: healthy confidence helps you persist. Dunning-Kruger. Confidence keeps you from even knowing you need to persist. The first says, "I'm not there yet, but I can get there." The second says, "I'm already there, so there's nothing more to learn." That's the real difference. Not confidence versus doubt, but confidence with doubt versus confidence that has forgotten doubt even exists. The former grows, the latter stagnates, and sometimes takes others down with it. So the work, if we're serious, isn't to eliminate confidence. It's to tune it, to hold our beliefs like instruments, checking for tension, listening for dissonance, adjusting when something doesn't sound right. It's a practice, not a destination, a rhythm of reflection that never quite ends. Because the mind, like any map, can drift off course, especially when it thinks it can't. And that's the paradox the Dunning-Kruger Effect invites us into. That wisdom lives not in certainty, but in the courage to question certainty, to stop mid-sentence and say, "Wait, am I sure?" That one moment, humble, hesitant, honest, can undo an illusion and open the door to real understanding. Not louder, not faster, just deeper. Let's bring it closer now, not to the world, to you. Because the hardest question the Dunning-Kruger Effect leaves us with isn't, "Why are people like this?" It's, "How do I know when I'm like this?" The truth is sobering. You don't, not in the moment, because the very nature of the effect is that it hides itself inside you. You think you're clear. You think you're informed. You think you're right. And so you stop looking. The only way out is through. And the first step is a kind of surrender, a radical admission that you are not exempt, not because you're unintelligent, but because you're human. And humans, all of us, are wired to overtrust our perception, to underestimate our blind spots, to mistake the feel of knowing for the fact of it. So start there, with doubt, not the kind that paralyzes, but the kind that opens. The next step, feedback, the real kind, not validation, not likes, not nods from friends who already agree, but sharp, specific, well-informed correction from people who know more than you. That kind of feedback hurts, which is why most people avoid it. We prefer comfort. We prefer compliments. But if you're serious about truth, about seeing things clearly, you need to invite discomfort and then not flinch. Ask someone you trust, whose insight you respect. What am I missing? What's the thing I keep getting wrong? What don't I see about myself? And then listen, really listen, not to defend, not to debate, but to understand. Because every unflinching mirror is a doorway, and if you can stand to look, you just might walk through. But feedback is only as useful as what you do with it. So we practice, not just once, not when it's convenient, but deliberately. We aim for the edge, the place where skill runs thin, where the work gets sloppy, where we flinch and fumble, because that's where the growth lives. But only if it's paired with something rare, immediate feedback, correction that comes while the mistake is still warm. It's not enough to just repeat. You have to repeat with awareness. Otherwise, practice just reinforces illusion. It makes you confidently wrong faster. So every loop must be intentional. Every action followed by reflection. That's the discipline. And it's quiet, unglamorous, private. But over time, it changes you. Not just your performance, but your perception, your posture toward knowledge. You begin to trust the slow road, the uncertain road, and slowly, you become less easily fooled, even by yourself. And underneath it all, beneath the feedback, beneath the repetition, there's something deeper, a way of seeing. It's called metacognition. Thinking about your thinking. The quiet discipline of stepping outside your own mind to look at how it's working. It asks questions. Most people never pause to ask, what assumptions am I making? What's guiding this conclusion? Where did this certainty come from? And does it deserve to stay? It's not a trick. It's a temperament, a willingness to challenge yourself, even when no one's watching. To admit at any moment I could be wrong, not as a performance, but as a posture. It's how you stop mistaking confidence for clarity and start learning to tell the difference between knowing something and knowing that you know it. That space between is where wisdom breathes. Of course, even metacognition has limits, because sometimes you'll still feel certain, still feel right, still feel that warm glow of confidence settling in your chest. That's when the real challenge begins, to not believe the feeling just because it's loud, to notice it and stay curious anyway. This is what it means to be comfortable with not knowing, to walk through life not with answers in hand, but with better questions, because the modern world trains us to speak quickly, to decide instantly, to hold strong opinions on everything. But real thinking moves slower. It's uncomfortable, messy, unresolved. And that's where insight happens, in the pause before the certainty, in the willingness to say, I don't know enough yet, Those 5 words can save you from saying 1,000 you'll regret. But saying "I don't know" takes courage, because we live in a culture that punishes uncertainty, that confuses pause with weakness, curiosity with indecision. So we perform knowing. We fill the silence with facts half-held. We argue not to learn, but to win. And we lose something quiet, something essential, the ability to wonder, to stand inside a moment without needing to resolve it. That's not indecision. That's discipline. It's what the physicist Richard Feynman meant when he said, "I think it's much more interesting to live not knowing than to have answers that might be wrong." That's not apathy. It's reverence, a trust in process, a respect for reality. Because the deeper you go, the more you see how much you've missed. And that humbling doesn't shrink you. It steadies you. That steadiness. It doesn't come from having all the answers. It comes from knowing you don't need them all. You just need to be awake to the limits of your mind, to the weight of your words, to the power of a pause before a claim. It's a kind of moral clarity, not built on superiority, but on sincerity, because the world is flooded with confident voices selling quick truths. And when you resist that rush, when you stand still, eyes open, mind soft, you become something rare, a listener, a learner, a light in the noise, not the kind that blinds, but the kind that helps others see. And it starts so simply: a breath, a question, a whisper to yourself. Maybe I don't know. Let's find out, because that whisper, repeated daily, becomes a compass, not toward certainty, but toward clarity. You begin to notice when the confidence feels too clean. You slow down before asserting. You check yourself before correcting someone else. And something strange happens. People start trusting you more, not because you speak often, but because you speak carefully, because your words carry the weight of thought, not the rush of impulse. You stop being the smartest in the room and start being the most attentive, not the expert on everything, but the one who knows how to listen, how to learn, how to ask. And that presence, quiet, steady, real, becomes your credibility, not the volume of your knowledge, but the depth of your humility. That's how we begin to unlearn the illusion and live like learners again. So here's the invitation. Don't chase being right. Chase being real. Learn to love the friction of uncertainty, the tug of contradiction, the pause that comes when your mind whispers, "Maybe I missed something." That's not a flaw. That's a feature. It's what keeps you open, teachable, alive. Because in the end, this isn't about psychology. It's about presence. It's about building a life where growth is constant and certainty is earned slowly, not assumed quickly. A life where you'd rather be honest than impressive, curious than convincing, humble than right. That's not soft. That's strength in its rarest form. And in a world full of confident mistakes, you might just be the one who sees clearly. Let's keep walking silent sage stories. Like, share, subscribe. And if this softened something in you, don't rush to explain it. Sit with it. It's already working. Zoom out. Take one step back from the mind and look at the world it helps shape. Because the Dunning-Kruger Effect isn't just a quirk of cognition, it's a force. And when enough individuals overestimate their understanding, it becomes a pattern, a culture, a system, a structure of belief built on half-truths and whole confidence. In democracies, it shows up in the voting booth. Citizens asked to make decisions on climate, economics, healthcare, armed with slogans, memes, and the assurance of a single podcast episode. We reward conviction, not comprehension. We elect fluency in performance, not depth in policy. And when those elected don't know what they don't know, they write laws that echo the ignorance that birthed them. It's not always malicious. Sometimes it's just misinformed. But misinformed confidence isn't harmless. It's how nations drift. And that drift doesn't just live in politics. It lives in institutions, in hiring committees that confuse charisma for competence, in meetings where the boldest voice sets the course even when it's off track. Over time, these choices compound. People rise not because they're best equipped, but because they believe they are, and because others believe them too. Researchers call it a confidence cascade. One loud overestimation validates another. And soon, entire systems lean toward certainty, away from doubt, away from listening. Cultures form that reward, knowing quickly, not deeply, where saying "I don't know" becomes a liability, where intellectual humility is seen as fragility instead of what it is, wisdom. And when that culture takes root in science communication, the cost is clarity. We saw it during the pandemic. Doctors and researchers trained to speak in probabilities carefully, cautiously found themselves drowned out by confident non-experts with simple answers and seductive certainty. Public health messaging, already delicate, was pulled into battle against conspiracy theories, dressed in confidence. The irony, the people most sure they were right, were often those furthest from the data, and those closest to the truth. The virologists, the immunologists, the cautious voices were the first to say, "We're still learning." But the public was tired of uncertainty, tired of nuance, tired of being asked to wait. So we turned to whoever spoke loudest, and the virus didn't care who sounded confident. Education hasn't escaped it either. When parents, armed with passion, but little pedagogy demand curriculum changes based on surface-level readings or viral outrage, when students, convinced of their own understanding, reject the structure meant to stretch them, when teachers, pressured to entertain rather than educate, begin to self-censor, the result isn't innovation. It's erosion of trust, of rigor, of the slow, careful shaping that learning requires. We forget, not all critique is expertise. Not all feedback is informed. And when everyone feels equally entitled to determine what is true in a classroom, truth itself becomes negotiable. Education becomes performance. Consensus replaces comprehension. And the student, instead of being guided toward the unknown, is trained to feel right, even when they're not. The danger here isn't just cognitive, it's moral. Because when we lose the ability to tell the difference between informed caution and uninformed confidence, we become susceptible to manipulation, to populism, to movements that feed on certainty, on outrage, on answers that feel good, but unravel under scrutiny. Hannah Arendt warned us, the ideal subject of totalitarian rule is not the convinced Nazi or the convinced communist, but people for whom the distinction between fact and fiction, true and false, no longer exists. It starts small, not with dictators, but with the dismissal of nuance, not with violence, but with the erosion of expertise, not with censorship, but with platforms that flatten all voices into one loud blur. And in that blur, when truth feels subjective, when knowledge feels irrelevant, power moves in, quietly, efficiently, wrapped in the warmth of false clarity. But it doesn't have to stay that way. We're not powerless against this effect, because as much as confidence can spread like contagion, so can humility. We can build cultures that reward reflection over reaction, that elevate questions over slogans, that celebrate the person who says, "I don't know, but I'd like to understand." Imagine that. A classroom where uncertainty is a sign of engagement. A workplace where the pause before a claim is seen as leadership. A society where expertise isn't envied or attacked, but respected. Where knowledge isn't just access, but process. Slow, messy, earned. And where the loudest voice isn't always the one that wins, just the one that listens longest before speaking. So maybe the question is, what kind of world do we want to speak into? One where everyone is certain and no one is right, or one where silence sometimes says more than sound? Because culture isn't built by institutions alone. It's built in conversations, in comments, in the small choices we make when we feel that itch to prove and choose instead to ask. That choice ripples. One person listens deeper, another notices. A tone shifts. An idea lands that might have been missed in the noise. And suddenly, there's space for thinking, for humility, for truths that don't fit in a meme. It won't trend. It won't scale quickly. But it matters, because wisdom doesn't spread through dominance. It spreads through invitation, like this. So the invitation stands to not just see the Dunning-Kruger effect as an individual flaw, but as a collective mirror. It reflects not just what we misunderstand, but how we respond when others do, with scorn, with silence, or with the quiet, difficult grace of remembering we've all been certain and wrong. So maybe the path forward isn't louder education, but deeper compassion. Not, how can they be so wrong, but where have I been blind to? Because every time we forget that knowledge is a moving edge, we inch toward the illusion that destroys it. But every time we remember that we're all still learning, we make space for truth, for each other, for a world that sees clearly because it doesn't rush to be right. Silent Sage Stories. Like, share, subscribe. This isn't just content. It's calibration for a world learning to think again. Let's return to the beginning, to that strange, aching question. Why do some people seem so sure of things they barely understand? Why do we've walked through answers, biases, blind spots, social systems that reward the loud and punish the slow. But maybe the real answer is quieter. Maybe it's this. We mistake the feeling of knowing for the fact of it, because certainty feels good. Like standing on solid ground, like exhaling after holding your breath. It's a high, and like all highs, it lies. But awareness, real awareness, that feels like floating. No foothold, no final word. Just the slow turn of seeing more, knowing less, and learning to live in the space between. That space, it's not empty. It's sacred. It's where questions stretch, where insight flickers, where humility grows roots that no wind can shake loose. And from that humility emerges something rare. Compassion, not just for others, but for yourself. For all the moments you were wrong and didn't know it. For all the times you spoke too soon, believed too easily, defended too fiercely, and for the grace to keep learning anyway. Because wisdom doesn't come from having been right all along. It comes from staying curious after you've been wrong, and from choosing again and again to listen longer than you speak. That's the paradox, isn't it? The more we learn, the more we see how much we don't. The circle widens, but so does the edge, that trembling perimeter between what is known and what is not yet even imagined. And those who walk that edge don't boast. They wonder, they whisper, they hesitate. not because they lack strength, but because they've met the vastness. And once you've met the vastness, you never speak the same again. Not with certainty, not with pride, but with care, with softness, like Socrates, who was called wise not because he knew more, but because he knew what he didn't know. That too can be your strength. So here we are, not at the end, but at the edge of what you believe, the edge of what you're certain of, the edge of what you've mistaken for truth. And maybe now you step back, you soften your grip, you hold your thoughts like fragile glass instead of carved stone, not to be weak, but to be ready, ready to update, to release, to grow. This isn't a video about others. It never was. It's an invitation to meet yourself more honestly, not to shrink, but to see, not to doubt everything, but to doubt better, with purpose, with poise, like someone finally learning to see in the dark. And when you see differently, you speak differently, not less, but more gently. You stop trying to win conversations. You start building them, one careful word at a time. You listen even when you know. You ask even when you're sure. You pause even when others rush. Because truth doesn't need defense. It needs space. And if you can hold that space for yourself, for others, for the slow unfurling of real understanding, then you've already stepped beyond the Dunning-Kruger Effect, not as a theory, but as a practice, a lived wisdom in a loud world, a stillness that listens back. So here's the last whisper. Let your confidence be earned, not assumed. Let your ignorance be acknowledged, not feared. Let your growth be quiet, but relentless. And let your voice, when it finally speaks, carry the weight of all you chose to question before you spoke. This is the path, not to being right, but to being real, to being human in full, soft, searching, still learning. Silent Sage Stories. Like, share, subscribe, and may the next time you feel certain, you pause, smile, and say, I'm still learning, because that right there is wisdom.